Hey guys, how's it going? So I decided to do my own project on the idea of cost of living. Um, so obviously right now that's a pretty popular topic going on. From where I'm from in Charlottesville, Virginia, it's actually fairly expensive to make get a decent place to live around here for reasonable prices. But I decided just to go over a few topics about it. In this I actually went over a couple of different policy initiatives that could overall be helpful in terms of reducing the cost of living nationwide. Um, I think I captured most of the key aspects of my essay I did on the subject. So figured I'd just jump right in. Um, Obviously speaking, the cost of living is not uniform to all Americans. It's very much a regional factor for a lot of people. Um, Not to mention there are a lot of people living with very different cases scenarios. Like obviously people who are living with joint income have a little bit of a advantage on those who are living on single income. Granted, people who do have children typically do have to end up paying more. Uh, so another one of those factors that might vary is geography. Obviously speaking, there are people from different states who have their own um, cost of living per state, and that can affect the cost of goods and services. Just basic geography can affect job prospects and wage prospects. So one of the points I made in the study was to look over the cost of living in a state like West Virginia versus the cost of living in a state like Hawaii. Uh, for the data I used for each of these states, I utilized the Missouri Economic and Research Center's cost of living data series. Essentially, what they ended up doing was breaking it down by CPI, um, and Consumer Price Index, and it took an account in all sorts of things like the cost of goods and services, just the cost of housing, and it put them in a large spreadsheet that went over the actual total amount in terms of rate of what places would cost the most to live versus the what places would cost the least. At the top of that list was West Virginia, which ranked about the lowest in terms of affordability. The highest was Hawaii, which was the most expensive state. And obviously, both regions have their reasons for that. Hawaii's obviously not landlocked; they have to get a lot of their goods and services, well, at least a lot of their goods shipped to them, so it increases the amount on that. West Virginia, fairly always been a somewhat impoverished state. So the key takeaway here is just because a state is cheaper to live in doesn't mean its prospects are necessarily better. In fact, oftentimes, low cost of living seems to correlate positively with poverty in a lot of these states. As you can see, West Virginia is just barely above the national poverty average of 11.1%, sitting at about 16.7%. So, one of the solutions I proposed for that was increasing the federal minimum wage. Uh, Obviously speaking, there hasn't been any sort of major increase in terms of the um, federal level since 2009. And the reason for that is that there's been a lot of political back and forth um, against doing that. And there is legitimate reason why certain states are against it. Obviously, West Virginia can't really afford a minimum wage increase of about $15, which is typically the popular number to throw out, like the whole fight for 15. But one of the proposals I reached was based on a article I had read by an individual. I believe the PowerPoint has a big cutoff. It was by economist Eric Doge Dib, and essentially what he proposed was greater coordination between the state and communities, utilizing Bay Area's local median wage as the gauge for setting the appropriate level of minimum wages. So my proposal was essentially having the federal government increase coordination with the states in order to increase the um, basically in order to create a regional model where essentially speaking the federal minimum wage would not be uniform. It would be decided by regional factors, all of which would be include like the minimum wage already set in those states, the average cost of living in those states, and from there you would calculate a you would create a framework model that would essentially have states categorized amongst each other in no particular pattern, but what would make sense in terms of affordability for businesses to be able to pay those wages. Like, say, for example, states like Oregon, California, Washington, this is an older graph, obviously, they would be categorized into one regional model and share a uniform minimum wage, whereas states like, say, for example, like North, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho would have their own set federal minimum wage. Um, and from there on, you just keep going around these states. Like this whole region in the southeast, we could see about setting a similar federal minimum wage rate. And you go so on. That way, you avoid decimating like smaller local communities and businesses that can't afford those wage increases. The second factor I looked over was inflation. Obviously, inflation, we've heard a lot about inflation over the last year or so. It was the thing that, at least I would argue, ended up costing the last administration in terms of the presidential election. It was something that was super um, hammered in by Trump. I think a big prospect. I think there are a few things about inflation that makes it a little bit tricky to deal with. Um, for starters, there's no really direct tools that the an administration can use to control inflation besides either increasing or cutting interest rates through the Federal Reserve. Um, so essentially making borrowing more expensive to making borrowing more expensive to pursue for investors. which in turn, which in turn decentralizes lending and slows down the economy. From the Biden administration, that's kind of what it seems like we saw. A general upwards tick in terms of uh, interest, an upwards tick towards interest rates for the reserve, but didn't seem to over stimulate the economy and cause a recession. The highest it had went was about 7.5%. But last I checked in 2024, it had dropped back to 2.9%. So I would say they were fairly successful. I think the major aspect of their campaign they struggled with and ultimately ended up failing on was steering public perception. Um, because despite this, there were still supply chain issues, but um, exacerbated and sort of downplayed um, the actual effects of that inflation decreasing over recent years. And finally, the last policy I spoke about was housing. Um, Again, housing is fairly expensive, depending on where you live. In Charlottesville, in Albemarle County, where I'm from, it's fairly high in general. Uh, Basically speaking, we've seen the housing market kind of increase in terms of value of homes, which is great if you are a homeowner, but if you're a home buyer, it's not particularly a buyer's market at the moment. Um, about almost 7 in 10 Americans claim that they are worried about the price of housing. Unfortunately, again, this is typically comes down to a state and local level of government. Obviously, look at municipalities can pursue zoning regulations, and that so can the state. In terms of options for the federal government, um, I believe that the most prudent solution to this issue would be increasing the threshold for to which to apply for a housing credit, which can serve as a incentivation, um, which can serve as incentivation and allow these people to actually be able to afford homes and uh, reduce their tax burden without directly having to lower taxes themselves. So I know a lot of these policies kind of seemed a little bit ambitious in many ways. Uh, the wage restructure would, you know, the wage policy would basically entail a complete restructure of how wages are addressed in the country. And personally speaking, it doesn't seem particularly realistic at the moment. One of the things I said was that any incoming administration would have to be very ambitious and very open-minded in terms of trying to implement these solutions. Um, but I do believe that these policies were if these policies were addressed and adapted, uh, they could overall reduce the cost of living for many Americans who struggle with it, including ones like me. um, so that's about all I had to say about that. Uh, Enjoyed taking the class with y'all. I am sorry if I'm very tired. I'm getting over a sore throat. These are all the references, but I kind of actually posted from my essay themselves. But yeah, that should be it.